I've been using my RG351M for the past half a year for portable emulation and with the hope of being able to play some of the older Persona games, which by the way I did complete Persona 2 Innocent Sin rather recently actually due to this. Well, that's honestly going well, and my review of the RG351M already came out a good while ago, with very positive reception from me. This got me thinking though. What are the differences between the ocean of portable emulators like this one? I'm starting off a series here where I test out some of the most popular ones, beginning with this one, the PowKiddy RGB10 Max. So let's go ahead and dive right in. And before we continue, don't forget to follow me on both Twitch and on Instagram. I will be streaming on Twitch fairly often, so I really don't want you to miss out on that. Also, why not go ahead and pledge over to the Patreon if you would like to support us? There are going to be monthly giveaways for members as a way of giving back. And then lastly, now do make sure to join the Discord because there are plenty of cool people over there. And subscribe, like this video, of course, for the usual if you end up liking it. Now on to the video. The exterior design consists of plastic and it is pretty lightweight in my opinion. It has a soft touch texture to the body that makes it more comfortable to hold and it does feel nice in hand. But this material won't really hold up for too long. It also doesn't help that there weren't any grips built in, as that definitely affects the comfort aspect. This is a larger device than the RG351, and you might be fooled into thinking that it's actually a Nintendo Switch Lite, but immediately you will notice some differences such as that it is just a little bit smaller. The analog sticks are pretty much the same, but they are symmetrical on this machine, kind of like how you would see on a DualShock controller or DualSense now in 22. The triggers are right next to the bumpers instead of behind them, and you have an additional 2 buttons for further navigation. This device comes in 2 colors, which are black and then this orange one, but I decided to go with the orange one since it helps distinguish it a little bit better from other devices. But overall, the exterior design seems alright, since I prefer the way that some of the buttons feel here. And the size is actually pretty nice for emulation, and even for someone with small hands like myself, but some grips around the back would have been great, since while this texture does allow for some comfort and for some grippiness, it will wear down pretty quickly this way, especially with your finger grease. Let's talk about the buttons now. The analog sticks feel exactly the same as the ones on the Switch Lite, at least to me they do, but maybe they have a little bit less resistance. And they're also clickable, though there aren't really any games that run on this device that will make use of L3 and R3, so it is mostly used to go back to RetroArch and access other emulator menus available on this device. The D-pad is pretty good in my opinion. It's not really too soft and it isn't really clicky, but there is a good amount of resistance that makes it great for a lot of different games, especially when it comes to fighting games, I suppose, but I prefer how it feels for platformers and things like that. The face buttons do have the Nintendo layout and have quite a bit of travel. These are actually not too bad to use, but luckily they still remain over the surface of the shell when pressed all the way. I, however, don't like how they are labeled because the labeling is actually on the shell for these instead of being on the buttons, which is a new one. It just makes this device look cheap, but it also doesn't really help much for making these buttons blend better in different emulators for different types of systems or anything like that, because muscle memory is always going to kick in and you're still going to remember what button is which, and you might not switch over right away when it comes to going to different systems. So what was the point of making it look this gross? The 4 buttons on the top and bottom are extremely clicky and have this echoey sound to them that make this device feel even cheaper. So I'm not really a fan of how these feel per se. However, if these were on a metal shell instead, I might actually feel pretty differently about these. Either way, you won't be using them much. On top, you have your triggers and bumpers, sleep-wake button, a reset button, Wi-Fi switch, 2 USB-C ports, one for data and the other for power, a headphone jack, a micro SD card slot, and a volume rocker. I don't mind much how the other buttons and switches feel, but the triggers are outright bad. They are difficult to press and don't really allow for a good amount of feedback, which makes it feel like you just missed it, or like you just missed the actual actuation of the button. The bumpers are clicky enough, sure, but really these are the only buttons that I have a real issue with, those being the trigger ones themselves, because they were done quite poorly in comparison to something like Anbernic's own offerings. The speakers are bottom firing, as you can see, except that there is only a single speaker, and this device just happens to have two speaker grills for some reason. One of them is probably for cooling though, but anyway, the speaker does still sound pretty good despite this bit that I just mentioned, so have a listen. So when it comes to general specs, this device features an RK3326 CPU clocked at 1.5 GHz, a Mali 31 GPU, 1 GB of RAM, and a 4,200 mAh battery. This unit came with a 32 GB micro SD card that did come with a bunch of games already and some emulators built in, and we are going to touch on those pretty soon. However, this device has a really nice display that I immediately loved from the moment that I started gaming with it. It features a 5-inch 854 by 480 IPS display that is very vibrant, very colorful, and games can look pretty sharp on this display. Hell, the interface itself looks very nice on this display, and it does feel like it's got a higher resolution than 480p, at least 720p, right? When you play certain games and sharpen up adequately. This is a 16:9 display as well, so when it comes to a lot of games the system can run, you might expect to get bezels for the most part, but actually, most of them do end up loading up at this aspect ratio by default, which is my preference. Some games will definitely appear to look more stretched, but others will feel much more comfortable to look at. And especially PSP, since that already runs at a native 16:9 resolution. This is a gorgeous display and a great compromise for the price. But when gaming or charging the system, I had to say this, there is a very obvious and somewhat distracting hotspot that is going to be right around the upper left corner of the display that even bleeds into the plastic section around there that gets hotter and hotter rather quickly. And I do get it if there has to be a hotspot that's warmer from the CPU, obviously. But that should probably be closer to the middle, if anything, just somewhere where it wouldn't be intrusive or distracting. Because in this case, because of its current position, you're using the D-pad, so that's still worth noting, and you are going to feel that warmth around that section. It's just a little bit distracting is all, I guess. This device runs on emulation, and it comes with a MAME, Capcom Play System 1, 2, and 3, Final Burn, PC Engine, Nintendo 64, NES, SNES, Family Computer, Game Boy, GBA, Game Boy Color, Super Famicom, Neo Geo Pocket, Game Gear, Genesis, Master System, Mega Drive, PS1, PSP, and DS emulators. And that's the last time I'm ever going to list them like this in future videos. This sounds like a lot of emulators, but technically there aren't really that many here, and notably Dreamcast is missing here. That's probably to reduce the amounts of storage taken up by the emulators themselves, especially since I'm definitely not touching most of these. Within this OS, we will be discussing PPS's PP, really, or I suppose just RetroArch in general. So let's talk about performance in different games within the different emulators. Performance with PSP games is going to be pretty good, and it is a rather enjoyable experience for the most part. This beautiful screen does do it a lot of favors, but at 1x resolution, it seems that most games will run totally fine, so I don't really find myself needing to make a lot of adjustments. It does seem like PSP is a pretty easy system to emulate, or at least it's just gone very far at this point. Granted, I do play a lot of JRPGs, so most of my testing did come from games like Final Fantasy IV, Persona 3 Portable, but I did also test out some action titles like Crisis Core, Final Fantasy VII, and Dissidia, which performed quite well. With some of the smaller games, whether they are platformers or just turn-based games, you should have a pretty easy time running them without many issues, if any at all, as long as you run them at 1x resolution. But even pushing them to 2x resolution should be fine for the most part depending on the game. However, this is few and far between regarding which games will still run at around 30 FPS while running at 2x resolution. So I would say that 1x is probably where you should stay, and frankly, this is still a very pleasant experience. So in my opinion, emulating Nintendo DS games kind of sucks unless you're doing it on a dual screen device, because you have to play on the smaller screen, and if the game that you play has touch controls or depends on the bottom screen, which will be the case for a lot of games, you do have to start switching back and forth by pressing the buttons. Make sure that you press the right one each time, and then you have to use a thumbstick to emulate a stylus. It just kind of sucks. It's not a lot of fun to play. However, if you still wanted to know how they performed, then you should be mostly happy with the performance. Pokemon games such as Black and Diamond ran quite well, but when moving over to something like Super Mario 64 DS, you will start seeing the limitations of this system, especially if you want a decent look to the game itself. However, another thing to note here is that this does not really stretch all the way, which is something actually that most people might prefer, and it does retain a squared aspect ratio. DS emulation is serviceable, but not really ideal on a device like this. I would rather just emulate it on a 3DS as it is already. So I tested some more JRPGs on the SNES and got very good performance. You can push most games to 2x as long as they are more pixel-based, but the 3D titles will start to chug at that resolution. So for those titles, I wouldn't really push it much and just stick with 1x. However, the Final Fantasy VI, which is Final Fantasy III on the SNES, runs quite well, and I haven't had issues emulating many SNES titles here. But I must admit that there aren't really many that I would be interested in running, so there just is a bias there. PlayStation 1 emulation was pretty much ideal. You can play with the original aspect ratio or stretch it, which is what I prefer. Playing Final Fantasy IX on this machine is great. However, I tried loading other games such as the Crash trilogy from the PlayStation 1 era, and none of them would load for some stupid reason. I still don't know to this day why that's the case. These ROMs had already come with the system as well, so I find it a little bit off that it can't even start the game. This actually started happening with other games like Final Fantasy VII over time, which is, again, so weird. I think that reinstalling these ROMs on your own might actually fix that issue, but I'm still not entirely sure. It might be worth a try, but this is still something that you shouldn't be dealing with. But it seems like with Final Fantasy IX, everything is fine, up until recently, since even Final Fantasy IX stopped working. These might just be corrupted files after all, and it seems like the PlayStation 1 emulator just isn't really working like it should. However, when it is working, you can push games to 2x resolution just fine without many hiccups. Emulating N64 is probably a big highlight for devices like this one, due in part because you can make Mario 64 run at 2x resolution and still run at close to 60 FPS when it comes to quite a few devices actually, which is always appreciated. This game looks beautiful on this system. I also tried out Ocarina of Time and got really nice performance here too, running at over 40 FPS for the most part, but there were hiccups along the way, sometimes some stutters and just some straight up audio issues or some audio glitches that would come up every now and then. It wasn't really a big deal to me, and these likely would have been ironed out with some tweaking. Lastly, I wanted to address the battery life on this system. It's not amazing, but still reasonable for the size of the battery, and it does also depend on what games you're playing. But my average is probably closer to around 4 hours on average, which is totally fine by me, since I don't usually game for that long in one sitting anyway. I just can't do it. In conclusion, I think that this device is a good purchase from a performance standpoint, and even with some of the controls, but the shell does feel pretty cheap to me, and the material is bound to start wearing out rather quickly. I know that a lot of people do like it, but I personally am not that big of a fan of it. However, you do get a beautiful display with good enough performance, even if I do wish that more PSP titles were playable on this machine, such as God of War, but that is a difficult one to run for around $129. And yeah, I did actually buy this on Amazon, which is why it ended up costing me that much, but I'm pretty sure that it's supposed to be, I think, around 100. Either way, even at that price, I don't think that it's too expensive, and it actually is kind of a good entry-level device for emulation. But it does have a lot of issues when it comes to reliability, at least a lot that I have experienced, particularly regarding PlayStation 1 emulation. I don't know why I've been getting these issues. Also, I would argue that the RG351P, which is a plastic version of the M model that I have, is probably a better value because even though it is smaller, it does have a beautiful playable display too, with grips, a better build, and better triggers as well. The buttons placement is also better for my preference. So personally, I would pick the RG351P over the PowKiddy RGB10 Max, but I understand that size increase is something that looks much more appealing to you. Trust me, I get it, because it is quite nice. And with that said, I am kind of mostly I'm a little bit lukewarm on recommending this one because of the issues that I've experienced with the PlayStation 1. However, based off of many other reviews that I have watched, it looks like performance on PlayStation 1 seems to be mostly pretty good, and they haven't experienced these issues, so it could just be a me problem, really. So yeah, I would encourage you to take advantage of any return policy in case of anything. And I also wanted to say that I am well aware of the existence of the RGB10 Max 2, which does address a good amount of the issues I noted, but doesn't really offer a performance boost from what I understand, which is why I decided not to review it. However, if you would be interested in seeing a review of the RGB10 Max 2, then do let me know in the comments, and I will be more than happy to make it happen with even a comparison between the RGB10 Max and the version 2 model. So yeah, keep me posted. So thank you so much for watching this video. I do hope that it was useful to you. I wanted to let you guys know that I do have affiliate links in the description in case you are still interested in getting it. They are going to be to Amazon, which means that they might be a little bit marked up. So do be careful there. However, if you do want to purchase them on Amazon, links are going to be down below, of course. And there's going to be ABUNDA if you would like to just pay for it a little bit more slowly. I do know that they offer like a bi-weekly payment system so that you could just pay it off within 4 payments or something like that. I tend to do that quite a bit actually when it comes to devices over $100, just because I prefer to take the payments a little bit more slowly. So links to that down below in case you are interested. Of course, you would be helping out the channel if you used it. I would love to give a very special thanks to the patrons as well, beginning with the tier 3s, which are going to be Omar and Saad Awazal. Thank you so much for all of your support because it really does go a long way. Now onto the rest of the patrons coming right up. And this is super important. I would just like to give a very special thanks to all of our patrons, which are going to be listed right here on the screen. Again, a massive thanks to you all for supporting us to help us create the kind of content that we bring to you on a day-to-day basis. And thank you so much for supporting the Tech Summit podcast as well. And just remember that if you would like to be a part of this community too, and then do make sure to check out the links to our Patreon, where you don't only get bonus episodes of our podcast, but you also get automatically entered into one of our monthly giveaways of a tech product that we have reviewed that is of at least $50 in value or higher. So links to that down below. Now don't forget to follow me on Instagram and also on Twitch, where I do stream relatively often. With that said, this has been Francisco from Tech Summit. Thank you for watching, and I will be seeing you all later. Enjoy.